Now, the first issue, as I mentioned, Mr Deputy Speaker, relates to this defence concern in our budgets. Now, there was a lot of debate around the so-called 2% of GDP figure as a target for defence spending. And of course, the Minister for Defence Industry and Mr Abbott, of course, as the previous Leader of the Opposition and then Prime Minister, made a lot of hay out of this comparison about the spending of the Labor government, the Rudd-Gillard government, and saying it was lower than the lowest level since 1938. Well, the irony of that, of course, was that 1938 was a Conservative government, which included Sir Robert Menzies. And of course, at the time, the state at which our defences and our abilities to deal with the threats we were facing at that time was seriously degraded. In fact, I'm very proud of my great-grandfather who ran for Eden-Monaro in 1940, whose son, my grandfather, was in the army at that time, fought in the Middle East and in Java and became a prisoner of the Japanese on the Burma-Thai Railway. But in 1940 he was very agitated about what had become of Australia's capacity, and he said, "We're seriously perturbed over the manufacture of munitions and mechanical equipment for our soldiers. We do not want our soldier sons, including his own, to be ill-equipped. We want them to have at least an equal chance." And he highlighted the fact that had our government, that is the Conservative government at the time, not sold, leased or dismantled our docks, this job could have been done. Manufacturers who have contracts for making various parts are complaining that they cannot get their money for the work done. Another matter hampering our war effort is the fact that our shipping line was sold, our trawlers were sold, and the invaluable boats and information gained by Australians in this industry is now in the hands of foreigners. Now, how tragic it is that those errors, those mistakes, were to be replicated at least another 2 times within our very short experience from the last 20 years or so in this parliament, in this building. And in particular, of course, this reference to this 2% of GDP target I'll firstly dispel, because in effect it was the Howard government that only averaged 1.78% in all of its 4 terms, and in fact fell to 1.68% in 2007, their last year in government, and that in effect was the lowest level of GDP spending since 1938, because as you review actual expenditures, actual data, post-budgets, it turns out that Labor's lowest budget was 1.69%. So it was actually the Howard government that was the lowest since 1938, as far as these comparisons are even relevant, because you're talking about percentages of GDP which is relevant to the size of the economy and expansion and contractions in the economy. And there's no way, of course, that the economy of 2007 to 13 is in any way comparable to the size of the economies back then, and the vast difference in expenditures in real terms that the Labor government was committed to in our time in government and during the Hawke-Keating years. And in fact, during the Hawke-Keating years, the percentage of spending never fell below very high levels of spending, in fact routinely above 2%, and in fact reached 2.31% at some point. But what was more important during that time was the planning and investment in Australia's defence capability. And when I talk about that, we also must refer to the fact that during Labor's time, we were the ones that actually have come closest to that 2% target since the Hawke-Keating years at 1.94%. But what was the problem that we were presented with? And this goes to exploding the myths that the Minister for Defence Industry is happy to run around. I just saw him just recently at an industry dinner, again parroting these comments that under Labor there was no ships commission and that we had put our shipbuilding into a parlour situation. Well, this is completely false. The truth of it is under Labor that we built our modern shipbuilding capacity. It was Labor that brought home the last 2 of the Adelaide-class frigates to be built in Australia to give us a platform to go from there and building our capacity. We then rolled that into the Anzac frigate-class construction process, giving our nation very serviceable and fine vessels through that project. But then, of course, that was added to by the Collins project, which for the first time gave Australia a submarine building capacity. Now, all of these projects together were really building ourselves a wonderful platform to have a world-class, efficient shipbuilding industry. But then when the Howard government came in, of course, there was none of that, no follow-on from any of that investment, none at all. And perhaps the most heinous related to the submarines. Now, for a very complex, difficult platform like a submarine, you need a long lead time of planning. To give you an example, the replacement planning process for the Oberon-class submarines began in 1978, and construction of the Collins commenced in 1990. So it's a 12-year span for a complicated platform. The planning for the replacement of the Collins-class submarine should have begun before the last boat hit the water in 2003, but nothing was done under the Howard government, not one thing to prepare for the replacement of our submarines, so that when we got into government in 2007, we had to start from scratch. So to say that there was no result in our 6 years of government, with the long span of planning that's required for these platforms, is just a complete joke and a furphy. And in addition to that, we of course inherited the failure to plan and prepare for the redundancy of our supply vessels. And it's famous now that neither of our supply vessels were able to respond to Cyclone Yasi, for example. Serious underinvestment also followed and compounded this problem in sustainment and maintenance, so both in those supply vessels, but particularly in relation to the Collins, so that by the time we hit government in 2007, we could barely get one boat in the water at any one time. We had to immediately inject $700 million into addressing that deficiency in our sustainment and maintenance, and we did so, and got to a much higher rate of availability by the time we were finished. But then, of course, we went through our due diligence on replacing the Collins. We invested a lot of effort into the service life extension process for the Collins to see how much time we could get out of them so they could roll that into the future submarine. We also did a lot of learning in deep cycle maintenance, which enabled that extension, including hull cutting and the like. But we also progressed in selecting the combat system, the ANBYG-1 combat system, which is now the system that will go into these submarines. We made that decision. And we, of course, made the decision for a land-based propulsion testing facility, the Specify facility, which were the two things you wrap a hull around. But we also spent $266 million in developing all of the lead-in activities that would be necessary for making a decision on the submarines. So then what happened? We were ready to roll, and then the Abbott government came in, and that famous captain's pick period, when he wanted to go off and get a Japanese Soryu submarine, without any process involved in that, until he was forced into it by his own backbench in this really rapid, bizarre process which no one had ever heard of before, the competitive evaluation process, which again was trying to steer to a result towards these Japanese submarines which weren't suitable for Australian needs. And so, of course, when Mr Abbott was removed from office, at least that process was put on a sounder footing. But huge delay, huge loss of time, huge extra cost now involved. Additionally, one of the key decisions that was made by the Labor government that I was pleased to be a part of was the commitment to building our supply vessels in Australia. Now, that was a critical decision that needed to be made to deal with the so-called valley of death that was emerging that would have emerged in our shipbuilding capability. And Labor, having invested $1 billion to resuscitate our skills and to get our capacity and productivity up in those shipyards, was all blown away by the current government. I commissioned advice from the department on the replacement of the supply vessels, the C-1654 project, and I'll quote you from what the department advised to me about that project. And they said a full in-country build for C-1654 could provide critical workflow to Australia's naval shipbuilding sector across all three shipyards, avoiding the costly decline of specialist skills between completion of the LHD and AWD projects and the start of future submarine. They advised that optimisation of in-country shipbuilding work would require some trade-off between cost, risk and schedule benefits for both the Commonwealth and industry to overcome the national shipbuilding valley of death and retain critical skills. Construction of hull blocks in-country rather than overseas could commence at multiple shipyards relatively quickly. With recent experience in ship consolidation, ASC could commence consolidation of the hull modules at Techport Australia as soon as the second AWD is launched in Q1 2016. In other words, when you look at all this, the avoidance of the valley of death, the speed with which these supply vessel constructions could have been done, under the department's advice, we could have been consolidating blocks for the final phases of construction of the first vessel right now. Instead, we saw the Abbott government try to hand this off first to the Koreans, and then, fortunately, because he was asking the Koreans to build a Spanish design, made no sense, even taking aside the issue of the fact that they should have been built here. But fortunately, the Turnbull government made the decision of sending those off to Spain at least, so that at least the Spanish were building their own vessel. But ultimately, the critical crime here is that those vessels should have been built in Australia, and that's the objective advice I had from Defence. So let's not hear any more nonsense from the Minister for Defence Industry about Labor not commissioning a vessel. In fact, we did commission a vessel. It was called HMAS Chills, which was the only vessel that was available to respond to Cyclone Debbie. So just as well we did. And the irony is, of course, under the 5 years of this government, they haven't commissioned a single main fleet unit. So their own rhetoric, it flies in their own face. Now, the final issue that I'd like to mention is Snowy 2.